Hey, greetings, friends, and welcome to April 6th. This is Lecture 1. I just want to say, man, I'm thinking about you and praying for you here. I know that as we enter into yet another week of this moment in history, this desperate crisis, that you're feeling the heaviness of it. You're feeling the heaviness of the disappointments that you've experienced, the sadness of loss. You're dealing with the uncertainties of the future, the the transitions you were intending to make throughout this summer. You are feeling the busyness that this new cycle of schooling has left upon you, and I just want you to know that I'm thinking about you, that I'm praying for you, that I recognize what you're going through. I'm hoping maybe this week could be a break in some of that rhythm. I know that we're supposed to have Friday through Monday off in terms of our work because that is Easter break, and we're sticking to that Easter break, and we will be sticking to that Easter break here in this class. And I hope that you're working through your spiritual journal, because that's more than just an assignment for me. It's actually good practice, and we're going to talk about practices this week in terms of spiritually formative practices and how those work in our lives. And journaling is one of those practices that I've been regularly engaged in for years now. I've got a box full of journals that nearly every day that I write, not every day, but nearly every day. And for me, it's an act of catharsis. It's me getting out of my own head. I don't know if you're like me, but I tend to be able to spin some things in my head. Journaling is a way for me to sort of get that out and get that on paper. It's a way for me to track where I am in my emotional journey, my spiritual journey. I track God's faithfulness through my journals. And so I try to be pretty raw, pretty open, pretty real in my journaling. And so I'm going to encourage you, if that's not a practice, maybe this class assignment will help establish that as a practice in your life, and then you'll grow from that. So I want to spend some time this week talking about, or specifically today, talking about finding wholeness and healing through our stories. Last week we sort of ended with what happens when our stories fall apart, when they fail us, when we realize that many of our stories are built upon shaky foundations, and the damage that does to us internally. So we're going to spend some time talking about that today. And there's also going to be a video that I feel like you really, really need to watch. It's going to be an interview with Dr. Kessler, who's going to talk about the stages of grief and all the way through the 5 stages of grief: depression, anger, bargaining, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And then he's going to walk us through into a 6th stage of grief, which is making meaning out of our loss. And for many of us, we don't even realize that we're actively going through grief right now. What you're feeling, the heaviness that you're experiencing, is a sense of grief, feeling the sense of loss. And so he's going to walk us through it. I really feel like it's a helpful video given the current context that we find ourselves in. Before we do this, though, I want to give you a little bit of devotional thought. I'm trying to help you just sort of recenter yourselves spiritually, and I want to just kind of keep encouraging you and reminding you of who you are in Christ. And as you find yourself navigating your own spiritual journeys through this crisis, God has a way of showing up in these disruptive encounters of life and doing some stuff with us and through us and in us that maybe we didn't anticipate coming into it, and we tend to walk out of these things different than we were when we walked into them. And so that's my hope and prayer that you would experience that bit of that yourself. And so I want to share a little bit of a story from the book of Judges with you. It's in Judges chapter 6. It's one of my favorite stories. It's a story of a guy named Gideon. So let me give you a little bit of history. The Israelites had come out of Egypt, out of their slavery and oppression. They wandered the desert for 40 years. And then in the book of Joshua, which was Moses' protege, takes them into what God calls the Promised Land. And as he takes them into the Promised Land, they find themselves inhabiting this new land. And there's still some enemies and some neighbors who aren't quite excited about Israel's presence in that land. And so they find themselves constantly in struggle, in tension with their enemies and their neighbors. And yet Israel, in the process of landing in this promised land, a land that God had given them, finds themselves not always acting in faithfulness. They tend to abandon what God had called and created them for, and they pursue their own desires and agendas. And God sort of says, okay, if you want things your way, then I will give them to you. When we talk about God's wrath, I think it's oftentimes we think about God sort of lowering the hammer on us. But a lot of times God's wrath is simply Him giving us the desires of our heart. And that can be scary. When we want things so badly that are counter to what God wants for us, and He says, okay, here, you can have it. I know that when I've had the things that I've thought I wanted that God didn't want for me, it's created a bit of havoc and dysfunction in my life. And so this is what happens to Israel, is God says, okay, if this is what you want, here, you can have it. And Judges 6 finds itself in one of those moments where Israel had sort of turned its back. They said, we've got this, and God said, okay, you can have it. And they found themselves under the threat of a group of neighbors called the Midianites. And then God shows up. God shows up to this one character. His name's Gideon. And Gideon when God shows up, Gideon is in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. So he's threshing wheat in a wine press. Now let me give you a little bit of background here. You don't thresh wheat in a wine press. You make wine in a wine press. You thresh wheat on the threshing floor, and the threshing floor is often a flat spot of land on the edge of the town that is out in the open, so that when you thresh it, the wind actually helps you separate the grains. And the reason why he's in the wine press is because he's hiding, because he's trying to keep what he's doing away from the Midianites. And God shows up in this moment. So God has a way of raising people up in moments to step out into the fullness for which they've been called and created. Each one of us are stepping into the fullness for which God has called and created us. And I love this. When God meets Gideon, the first thing He says to Gideon is, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now, I want you to think about this, how obscene this seems, how absurd this is, that God comes to a man who is in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing because he's afraid. In fact, this couldn't be any more of a moment of cowardice. And God shows up, and the first words that He speaks to Gideon in that moment is, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And if that's me, I'm doing a check. Like, what? Mighty warrior? I'm not a mighty warrior. I'm a coward. I'm hiding. What do you mean, mighty warrior? Then he goes on to say this, "Pardon me, Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, then how has all this happened to us? Where are all His wonders our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." And the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Now again, this man had done nothing to demonstrate that he is any way a warrior of God. In fact, he demonstrated the alternative to that he was in fact a coward. And now as God is saying, "I've created you for this. I am sending you to save Israel." And then He says this, "Pardon me, Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." That's the excuse. That's the excuse that our shadow side. Remember on last week when we finished, I talked to you about how when our stories fail us, when they come unraveled, it does damage to our souls and creates for us a shadow side, this side of us that lives out of the woundedness of our failed stories. Israel's story felt like for Gideon that it had failed him. It had left him fearful. It left him struggling. It left him damaged. And in that damage, when God comes to him and says, "I've got a role for you, I've got a responsibility for you," he couldn't see beyond the damage that had been done to him because of his failed story. All he could see was the excuses that should exempt him from God being able to use him. But here's what I want to say to you today. God does not see you based upon the damage that's been done to you. God sees you as the person He's created and formed you to be. God's not determining your future by what has happened, but what God is calling you to. So no matter how broken and fragile and dysfunctional your story has been, God is not determining your future based upon the limitations of your past. God is not identifying you based upon threshing wheat in a wine press. He knows you as He's created you to, not as you see yourself. And I think that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind, is that because of the damage of our stories, the brokenness, the hurt, the pain, the struggle, the grief, the sadness, the dysfunction, the shame, the guilt, all of that stuff that tends to play a part in the creation of our shadow side, the side that lingers in the brokenness, that looks at the darkness of our lives, that we tend to get so trapped by all of that. But that's not how God primarily sees us. Gideon had done nothing at this point to demonstrate that he was a mighty warrior, but that is who God had created him to be. So one of the things that I want to say to you as you're navigating all of this is that God sees in you what you don't see in yourself. That God is not determining your future based upon your past. That God is not talking about how He's going to use you to fulfill your story based upon the limitations of your story right now. Yes, you're dealing with dysfunction and brokenness and hurt and pain, and there's been struggle all the way through. You're let down. There's a sense of sadness. There's a sense of grief. There are moments when you feel like you just want to give up. Why even worry about it? What does any of this even mean anymore? But God is going to meet you, and He's going to say, I've got something for you. And when He says, I've got something for you, it's not based upon the limitations of where you've been, but upon the future that is unfolding right in front of you. And so God looks upon you today, and He's saying, I've got something for you, mighty warrior. I've got something for you, ambassador of hope. I've got something for you, agent of God's love in this world. I've got something for you because you are stronger, better equipped, and have been created to be used by me in such unique ways. And I want to encourage you today that no matter where you feel you are, when God disrupts your life, He's not going to let you live mired in what you thought about yourself and all of your excuses for exemption of why you shouldn't be used by God to make a difference in this world. He's going to call you out in a way that reminds you of who you've been created to be, not who you see yourself as. And so I want to encourage you today that you are, in fact, mighty warrior, even when you don't think you are. I love you. God bless you. We'll roll into the lectures in this next lecture.